Welcome to Concussion Talk Podcast. I'm Nick Mercer. This is my first podcast since August, and I'd just like to thank everyone for listening and for listening to my Bike Trip Across Canada podcast I did this past summer. This is episode 30 of Concussion Talk Podcast, and I'll be talking to Alan Champagne. Alan is a PhD candidate at Queen's University. He is studying sports-related concussion using neuro-imaging and looking at sport-specific biomechanics. Here is Alan to discuss his research. Okay, I'm talking to Alan Champagne now, and I will get him now to introduce himself and describe more fully his research. So, Alan, please.
So thank you for having me. So my name is Alan Champagne. I'm a MD PhD student here at Queen's University under Dr. DJ Cook, who's a neurosurgeon for the university. And so I work with the Center for Neuroscience Studies, which is a multidisciplinary program at Queen's to look at, investigate the brain and from different aspects. So our research specifically is really focused on integrating cutting edge neuroimaging practices. So using the MRI to model the brain physiology after head trauma. So head trauma could either be after a sport-related concussion, which is obviously a big topic of interest now in athletes, but also the effects of repetitive subconcussive trauma, which are impacts to the head that don't really cause any symptoms and or kind of go under the radar. And so if you think about football players or any contact sports, they receive a lot of impacts. And so what we're trying to figure out is, number one, does the brain change or fluctuate after these impacts? So using different methods, looking at blood flow, cerebrovascular activity, and other brain metrics that we can use to investigate whether or not the brain can fluctuate. And so question one is, what is the effects of these impacts on the brain? Number two, what we're trying to leverage here is our expertise in sports and technology to integrate different ways to actually measure those impacts. So, one would be the biomechanics of these impacts. So we have helmet accelerometers in the helmets of all the football players here at Queens, and so we investigate basically the exposure of these players. So like how they get hit. So from a biomechanical standpoint, and so how often they get hit and where. And the third part is we use video analysis to actually then watch these players play in the game. So I'm also a coach for the football team as well here. So I get to manage these guys on the field and use that knowledge to change coaching practices. And so it's really a multimodal approach where we use the imaging to inform us about the effects of these impacts and then use different technological events like the accelerometers or different film analyses to then change the behavior on the field. And now we're expanding that to different high school as well. So,
great. So, do you restrict this to just football?
No,
Your
we
research?
have so now we have a project with a bunch of high school teams for football teams, and we're hoping to expand this into hockey as well. Like this year, what we're waiting for is really a team to commit to our research, and so. Usually that's the number one step.
Okay, cool. So, so you mentioned you study biomechanics and how that impacts it impacts sort of part of the pun there, but it affects the subconcussive hits or the concussive hits that matter. So what about my biomechanics studies are sport specific biomechanics or are they just general
No, they
ideas
are.
of
So there's like two ways that we think about the biomechanics. So one is the true the metrics. So if you look at the linear and rotational parameters of an impact, and so that's what the accelerometers are for, right? They're in the helmets and they can quantify the really deep metrics to characterize each impact. So what was it? What were the linear components? What were the rotational components? What was the location, the force, and
okay.
etc. And then I think there's also a more qualitative stand where you can look at the reason for the impact, so the player's technique. And so I'm a big believer that the risk of each individual is really deep grained into the players' behaviors on the field. So the way they play and their style of play. and whether that can be changed based on different coaching practices, and or proper education to the player about their metrics, their technique. But we and that's what we're kind of looking to it now. Like, how can we one assess the players, figure out what's bad about their technique and what's their risk, and then use that to actually inform our coaching practices. So it's really taking an evidence-based way to cater coaching practices, and just like teaching in a new way that's using the science and the evidence behind it.
Well, great. That actually answers my question about what do you hope this research will show. But
Well, it's showing already. Like we
yeah,
see a lot of great. Uh, well, we get a lot of great feedback from the players because they can appreciate the idea of using the science to better their
yeah,
game. But we also find that there are fluctuations in the brain that may not be necessarily related to head impacts directly, but that to some metrics fluctuate over the season. And so now what we're trying to figure out is, are there players that are more susceptible to that or not? And is there ways for us to actually mitigate that? So
yeah.
if we change the player's behavior, can we actually limit those effects? Um,
So and you're a good one to teach them about biomechanics because you played football, right? For in the
yeah,
states for your
yeah. So
university.
I played for the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill, so the Tar Heels.
Yeah.
Played a bit of fullback, a couple of D line, and then some teams there. And so that's one of the things that our team really wants to focus on is using our expertise in the sport,
Yeah.
and so to really leverage the research. And so it's quite difficult to go to um, do something if you don't really have an authority with them. And so it's great to have that relationship with the guys because they can appreciate where I come from, and that our research and our lab isn't there to really hurt the sport, but instead to really enhance the sport. And
Yeah.
so it's definitely a good mix of the two. A little bit of science expertise and a little bit of football expertise together makes this project possible.
So have you been in contact with like the hockey coaches or the or phys ed department about them helping out with your studies for say hockey or
Yeah, so
rugby or
we've been in touch with a few teams and departments around Kingston. And then now that we have another project going on called the Neuroprotection Project, and so it's available online. It's easy accessible. But what this project is about is we've defined a new baseline. So for football teams, and the baseline incorporates both the performance aspect and also a sport specific drills that involve some tackling and some blocking. And what we do is we actually film every kid using cameras from different angles,
okay.
and then we score them. And so we then educate the kids and the coaches and the trainers about the technique that they need to work on. And so this is really attractive for high schools with the Rowan's Law just coming in. That requires some injury prevention initiatives to be taken. And so what we're trying to do with this project is really set the gold standard for that in terms of injury prevention for football right now as a sample. And then now that this has been done and is working quite great, we're not getting interest from hockey teams and rugby teams because it's the
Great.
same idea, right? You assess the mechanism of injury that are related to concussion or to more to head trauma, and then you find ways to actually change that and improve that on the field or on the court or on the ice. And so the fundamental idea is that we can use science, we can use data to tell us where the risk is for each player, because the risk is to me is really at the individual level. It's not, of course there's team risk and there's risk involved with the environment, like
Yeah.
depending on what kind of, do you play on turf, do you play on grass, do you play on ice. But in the end, to me, what the main risk is really to the individual. And so
Well,
it's my job as a coach to find that risk, or as a scientist, it's my job to find that risk and to educate the coach about how to better target and enhance his coaching practices to make his players better, but also safer players.
okay. So you're back to biomechanics now. You said that you want to assess the risk. So do you concentrate only on impact like tackles or well, I guess tackles,
So
or do
it
you
just depends.
look at how they're falling or or like
Yeah.
how big they are, stuff like that. Like,
Yeah, one of our project that I have one of my students work on is looking at game film,
okay,
and we look at game film and we look at different ways to figure out why guys get hit and how can we actually change that.
okay,
And so really what it comes down to is there's a few papers on mechanism of injury looking at like for every sport, here are the things that are more here are where guys get hit more often, or here are where guys get or girls get injured more often. And so once we know that this is kind of where the risks stand, and then we can actually test that. We can assess that on our players and say how do our players do in this situation, and the players that don't do well may be at higher risk. And if that's the case, then we can change that using some behavior modification technique. And again, the big idea behind the behavior modification comes from Dr. Kevin Guskiewicz and Eric Schwartz. So Guskiewicz is at UNC, where I did my undergrad, and so I trained under him for quite a while. And then Eric Schwartz is at the University of New Hampshire, and so they've started this idea about a few years ago, and we're trying to bring this to Canada and really help us use that to help us make the game safer,
oh,
without taking away the integrity of what the game's about, right? So the physicality, the competitiveness, the brotherhood. So there are a lot of really good things about sports.
yeah,
And with head injuries right now, there's a lot of debates around whether or not we should keep going with these sports. And so what we're hoping to really provide the field and the literature and parents and anybody out there is a solution.
yeah.
So not to cancel the sports, but to make it safer using the science behind it.
Speaking of the science behind it, the neuroimaging. So, what do you look for in your neuroimaging? In your just MRIs, or is it like
No,
like flows of blood or flows of?
yeah. So there's a few gadgets that we have. So the MRI obviously is one big scanner. It's a 3T Tesla. We have it at Queens with the CNS, which is great because we have access to we have a great research facility here. And so what we look for with the MRI is a few different things. Um, you can look at integrity of the white matter, and so there's different white matter tracks that um, have shown to be susceptible to head impacts. And so we look at that integrity. Then we can look at the connectivity between those tracks. So how well do different regions of the brain can not really speak to each other, but really like function together using some different.
Is that dark matter?
Pardon?
Is that the dark matter that does that?
No, the gray
The
matter.
gray
Yeah,
matter. Sorry,
yeah. The gray matter in
I'm
your brain,
watching
your,
TV too much.
the functional part of your brain, and then the white matter would really be the tracks that connects them.
Right, right.
And so you can look at the integrity of the track. You can look at the gray matter functionality. We can also look at the vascular response. So the vascular physiology in the brain is highly guiding towards like the metabolism and your resting, oxygen demands. And so your brain will adapt or react in different ways to maintain that homeostasis, right? So we look for things like blood flow and other metrics that we believe may underlie the symptomatic response to the injury. And so we think that if these metrics are disturbed, there may be a cascade of other events that could relate to the symptomatic response after a concussion, and or even the asymptomatic response and the slow buildup of trauma that may accumulate over time. So we use these metrics to really understand if that is that one, if that's the case. Two, if there's regions that are more susceptible. So are there region-specific susceptibility across the brain that we can kind of pick up and understand? And then is there a relationship between that and the biomechanics? And so if in the end, like we can't really look at things in islands, right? It's a one big model. There's movements involved. There's there should be some MRI involved. There should be some biomechanics involved, and all together they tell you the real problem and or the real solution. So there's two ways to see it. And so we're really trying to bring in all this different knowledge to educate us and inform us about what is really going on, and then how can we fix it.
Well, great. I was going to ask you about it, how you measure it and stuff, but you've described the videotapes and the accelerometers. But so what are you doing up at this? I mean, now you've been up for a few hours, you said, and it's only It's only 7:30, 7:48 here, and there's like what quarter
6:16 here. Yeah,
6:50. There you go,
yeah.
and you've been on for 2 hours already. So,
Yeah, well, I mean,
wha-
we have a few projects going on right now. So obviously, fall is always a busy time of the year with coaching here at Queens, and then working with the project. And so we've taken on the whole school board here in Kingston.
oh,
So the
nice.
whole school board, which is just Limestone District School Board in Kingston, has
Yeah.
taken initiatives to really set a standard with the Rowan's Law. And so they've committed all their junior football teams to the neuroprotection project, where we
Oh, sorry.
use the cameras to.
Do you want
Pardon?
to just mention what Rowan's Law is? Do you want
Yeah,
to just
so Rowan's
mention?
Law was a law that was passed by the Ontario government just recently. I would say that within the last 2 months, following an incident that happened 3 years ago in rugby. And so the law, which is coming in this year, has a few objectives. One being education, and so educated. We want to educate teachers, trainers, athletes, pretty much everybody that's involved in sports about what are concussions, how do they happen, what are the symptoms, what are the proper mechanism for return to play, return to learn. And so it's really about increasing awareness of the injury and as a community, which is great. And so we have a program called CESAP, which stands for the Concussion Education, Safety and Awareness Program, and that program really caters to that education. So, really filling that gap that we have here in Kingston, and really educating everybody about and increasing awareness about head injuries. The second part of the law is an injury prevention initiative. So they're trying to define a code of conduct, and the code of conduct is supposed to be some recommendation to teams and sport organizations about how to reduce injury. And
Oh, okay.
so that's not very clear in the law. I don't know. We know where to go with this yet. We just want to set the initiative out there. And so, because we knew the law was coming, our team really, designed this project, the neuroprotecting project, to cater to that demand. And so, really feel the demand here and say, we think we have a pretty good idea on how to redesign sport-specific baselines. So baselines again that involve assessments that can target mechanism of injury. So for football, it'd be tackling and blocking,
Yeah.
and then evaluate that and then use that to make sure that teams are safe and using safe practices. And so because of that, I guess that timing, the school board here really took that on and is trying to set the gold standard, which is awesome. And so anyway, the point is that we have all these athletes that we tested last week. So we have about 400 athletes that we tested in the last week. And now they all have to be scored and all that. So on top of that, and then the work with Queens, and then the other project that we have going on, it's just there's not enough hours in the
Well,
day. So
yeah,
4 hours,
exactly.
no, everybody's sleeping, nobody's bothering me, so I can get my work
Yeah.
done. And
Perfect. So,
exactly.
actually, last question: do you find any difference between your high school students, your football players, and the queens or older that
Yeah, so
those
we
football
yeah,
players?
so
The age difference.
we've tested athletes between I think 11 all the way from about 9-year old
Wow.
all the way to about 25. So
Okay.
your college players,
Yeah.
and so we have a quite a wide range of understanding for the technique. And the idea with this is really to understand how the development works, right?
Yeah.
So is there an age that's either more susceptible, and or is there an age where the learning curve actually becomes
Picks up.
exponential?
Right.
Exactly. So we want to know. I want to know or understand, and then is there a position that actually matters? So if you look at factors like position, age, where they come from, like do they play in Quebec, do they play in Ontario, do they play, right? Which program or school board they play for? Is there a team that's, like there some coaches are better than others, and that's the
Yeah.
bottom line.
Yeah.
And some coaches have priorities
Yeah.
on safety, and so we will try to understand now, like, is there a regional differences across the school
Okay.
board,
Okay.
and then across Quebec as opposed to Ontario, and then so all these different things that we try to basically who's the safest and why.
Right.
And so yes, we do definitely see changes across age groups, but that's not that's expected because
Yeah.
you would think that as you play you get better. The
Yeah.
better question is more like at this age group, what is the norm?
Okay.
And so once you know what the norm is for a specific age group or a specific position at that age group, you can then say how far are you from the norm,
Great.
and then help players either get better and or surpass the norm and and become and then reset the norm standard, right? So
Right.
it's quite interesting to see this shift in the culture. We're really trying. You can see in Kingston now, like coaches are really, they're really open to the idea of involving safety in their practice, and they're really receptive to the project. And so it was great to see this community-based effort to make the game safer. Because in the end, it's a team effort. It won't just come from us, and it won't just come from the coaches, and it won't just come from the government, right? We all have to sit together at the same table and say, from all the parties involved, how can we actually move this game forward without
That's awesome. So thank you. There's definitely something I want to come if I can talk to you again. That'd be great later
Sure.
in the year or whatever. But
Yeah.
this is yeah. So thank you so much for talking to us today. For me today. Is there any football practice today?
Yeah, we have a practice today. I think at 4:30. So if you're in Kingston and you want to come around, just come see
Nowhere
me.
near Kingston, but yeah. But anybody is in Kingston for 4:30.
Pardon?
Rich,
Weather, I think it should be good. Yeah,
the weather's okay there today for it.
hope
Guess
so. Hopefully.
you practice and everything, don't you? So
Yeah, we'll be there anyway doing some science. So
yeah,
whether it's cold or hot or raining or snowing,
yeah.
there'll be science going on.
Nice. Well, thank you so much, Alan.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you again to Alan Champagne for a great interview and I think a great discussion about his research. You can follow him on Twitter at the FB Scientist. Queen's University is my alma mater, and I hope this is the first among many discussions with those at Queen's who are interested in concussion. This is about the time I would normally say go to my website www.concussiontalk.com, but right now my website is a bit wacky, it's a bit out of sync. But please, you can listen to my podcast, and hopefully I'll see you again next episode. Thank you. As always, music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.